A perspective now from someone who knows politics and foreign affairs inside and out. Hugh Segal is Master of Massey College at the University of Toronto. He's a former senator and former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, among his many roles. He's also the author of a book about Canada's foreign policy entitled Two Freedoms, Canada's Global Future. He spoke to us from Toronto. Hugh, first of all, how significant a change, if any, do you think this landscape of foreign policy that Freeland has laid out, how significant a change is it, do you think?
I think Minister Freeland has actually taken Canadian foreign policy to a whole new plateau of important principles and commitments which did not heretofore exist, at least under the present administration. I think the present administration, understandably, would have been in some opposition to what the Harper administration appeared to be for, was looking for a more open approach to the world, a more engaged approach, opening doors to Iran, opening doors to Russia. Quite understandable. It's a traditional sort of large L liberal position in our broad dynamic of Canadian politics on foreign policy. I think what Minister Freeland has brought, and I think it's in some measure because of her background as an international journalist who has worked in Moscow and Washington and New York and kind of understands that world with a perhaps greater measure of depth than some of her colleagues in cabinet, is a very heavy and important dose of sanity and reality to what a middle power like Canada has to be prepared to do, has to step up and support, and to make clear that there are no contradictions between having an approach that's engaged with respect to the world as a whole, but also supporting some of the very core fundamental principles of the Western world that take us all the way back to the Atlantic Charter, agreed to by Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, democracy, open markets, a rules-based international order where middle powers like Canada can have the greatest effect, the UN, etc. So I think in that sense, she drew some very important lines. I hope they're not in the sand. I think they're real, and I think her leadership on this is really to be celebrated.
She acknowledged that critics would say that some of this is too abstract. Is that fair criticism? Does this fit?
Well, the fact that she would mention it indicates that she is quite sensitive to what has been the populist cant, if you wish, in places like the United Kingdom and the United States and in Le Pen's part of France, namely that all these international principles are good, but they don't relate to real life on the ground where people are living, where they have economic and other challenges. And that has been the main argument in favor of the kind of nationalist, closed world approach which has been associated with Mr. Trump, Madame Le Pen, and others. And I think what she has done is indicate that, in fact, these so-called abstract principles, such as democracy, rule of law, judicial independence, gender equity, international cooperation, are actually not just abstract. They actually relate to the kinds of opportunities young Canadians will have, to the kinds of economic capacity we will have to sustain our economy going forward. We live in a country, as you know from your own experience, where 30% of our standard of living is tied to trade, and 70% of that is trade to the United States. So as a trading nation, we need these international rules to be in place. We need a strong Navy, for example, to help keep the sea lanes absolutely free, because we get 90% of what we need in Canada by sea on a regular basis. So she was making those linkages in a way which I think is very much to her credit, and I think it's an important part of the debate that will now obviously follow in Canada.
She talks about leadership and the role that Canada might play. That may be aspirational. Is it overly ambitious given the size of the country and the sort of kind of role Canada plays?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. The history, whether it's under Mike Pearson or John Diefenbaker or Louis Saint Laurent, for that matter, or Stephen Harper or Brian Mulroney, has never been to assume the role of a major military power which can throw its weight around. That's not who we are. We've never gone to war on our own. We've never started a war on our own, but we have been there, foreign policy terms and diplomatic terms, and if necessary in military terms, when our allies have been attacked or when core fundamental principles like international sovereignty have been under threat. And the point that I think the minister was making very eloquently was that we have to stay engaged on those issues, whether it's Crimea, whether it's the protection of our Eastern European NATO partners, whether it is engaging with respect to ISIS and other challenges. Canada cannot withdraw into the comfortable cocoon of saying we're geographically separate. The Americans will protect us anyway. So what is the problem? That has never been the Canadian approach, and moreover, to do so would limit the ability of Canadians to have any impact at all in the way we have in the past on issues like peacekeeping, on issues like the construction of NATO, on issues like investing heavily in the post-Soviet Russia to encourage democracy and investment, as Prime Minister Mulroney did. These are the points that I think she was trying to make, and I think she did a very good job.
How do you think it might affect relations with the United States?
I think there are now, if I may say so, two levels to that relationship. There is, quote unquote, the White House and whatever is going on there from time to time, which is a challenge for a lot of people these days, both in the United States and Canada, to decipher and figure out. Then there is the important relationship with the American bureaucracy, the American military, the American business community. I noted the other day that both the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the American Chamber of Commerce were meeting together in Washington to plan joint strategy to make sure that the best parts of NAFTA are preserved and sustained. I think that relationship, the relationship that is permanent, is the one that is going to matter more than what may or may not be the transient circumstance associated with any particular White House. You will recall that Prime Minister Trudeau, number one, so to speak, never had a great relationship with Richard Nixon, had a working relationship which was, shall we say, tentative with President Reagan. On the other hand, the overall relationship between our two countries stayed strong and allowed great progress to be made on issues like acid rain and on free trade, notwithstanding all that. So I think it's important that we keep that sense of perspective. The relationship with the United States, I don't think, is at threat. I think the commitments made on foreign and defense policy are frankly helpful in that respect. And whatever the vagaries are of the present occupant of the White House or subsequent ones, we have to look at the core relationship, which runs deep, runs very profoundly, and is of huge value to both sides of the border.
One final question. Does the defense review, the elements that have been laid out in that paper, do they provide the appropriate backup for the broad principles that she outlined?
So I think it's a very, very good start, and I give the government great credit for that. And I give credit to people like Bill Graham, who chaired the Defense Policy Review, former foreign minister and defense minister in previous governments. And I think the government has taken appropriate steps to say, we understand the requirements. We're going to begin the process of making sure there's funding and new acquisitions in place for that to transpire. That being said, the maturity question for our political system on military procurement has yet to be addressed. There is a bipartisan consensus in Australia. Governments come and governments go, but whatever they committed to in terms of ships or planes or other important assets to keep Australia safe does not get disrupted when governments are defeated or new governments come into power, so they have a steady stream of work that is fundamental. We have had the opposite in Canada. I remember a commitment made by the Mulroney government to the EH-104 helicopter, fundamental for our Navy, fundamental for rescue. Prime Minister Chrétien canceled those. We're still waiting for helicopters, and that was almost 30 years ago. We need to have more maturity between the political parties. I noticed that when Lisa Raitt ran for leader, of the Conservatives, she talked about making procurement a priority at the Prime Minister's level. I think putting the parties together in the House of Commons with the procurement plan so everybody buys in or makes changes so it's there, notwithstanding what may happen in 2019 or thereafter, is a way to ensure that they do deliver on the promises they made, which I think they made in good faith, so that our armed forces do get the kit and the support they need to do the very important job they're being asked to do.
Hugh, thank you very much for your expertise on this.
Thank you, Alison.